This is the first MP3 unit for the Genesis module of the field-based SPS. It was recorded by Wilrens Hoenstra on 26 February 2010. Its subject is important themes or topics in Genesis. I'm going to give you 6 that hopefully will help you to maintain focus as you read and study the book. If you have not done so already, it would be good to pause at this point and read through the Read First file, or do this right after. As stated there, the focus of these lectures on Genesis will be on the first 11 chapters of the book. I will not deal separately with chapters 12 through 50, because I think these stories are more easily understood and don't require much help. The real issues, the controversies, and the tough questions are located in the first 11 chapters. Also, these beginning chapters are so foundational for our faith, for theology, for a biblical Christian worldview, that they are worth the time and effort that we will put in. However, there will be some helps and hints for the second part of the book spread out in this and the next recording, Unit 2, so you may want to pay extra attention to this. The first of these 6 themes, the most important one, is that of beginnings or origins. Obviously, this is what the book is about. It tells us about the beginning of the world, the beginning of humanity, of sin, of marriage, of many different peoples. It tells us about the beginnings of Israel and of the tribes of Israel. It gives us explanations for certain names and customs. It is a book of beginnings. Often when we ask why is this particular story included in the book, the answer will be related to beginnings. One kind of beginnings is particularly important in the book, and I think we should consider it a separate theme. The second theme or topic is that of the promise, and with it the covenant. When you pay attention to it, you will see that this promise, which is first given to Abraham in chapter 12, is repeated a number of times. Every time it's a little different, and there are several elements that together make up this promise. It's easy to recognize and to trace this, but it is also important to see this developing promise in the book. And it is linked with the idea of covenant, which means that God backs up his promise in a formal way. Today we would set up a contract, a written text, and 2 parties agreeing on something would sign this. In those days, they would use a different form, more personal, more serious in a way, covenant. If you were serious about an agreement or some promise you had made, you would back it up with a covenant. And that is what we see God doing in this book. There are different ways of making a covenant. One such way is what Jacob and Laban do after Jacob has run away and Laban has overtaken him. They agree on certain things and then erect a heap of stones as a sign and reminder, and they eat together. This is a simple way of making a covenant. In Genesis 15, where God makes a covenant with Abraham, it's a little more complex. Abraham is told to take several animals and cut them in halves. He is to lay down the halves of each animal opposite of each other. This was an established form of making a covenant. Normally, both parties would go through the midst of these half animals. In this way, they were essentially saying, "Thus may it be done to me if I do not keep this covenant," though it's a serious commitment to make. But what happens in this case is that Abraham does not go through the pieces. He sees how a torch and a smoking pot make that move. Symbols of God's presence. So only one of the parties goes through the midst of the pieces, meaning it is a one-sided covenant. Only God puts himself under oath and commits himself to do something. It's a promise, not an agreement with mutual obligations. Of course, the promise as a theme begins earlier than this. We have a promise following the flood, also with a covenant, and we have the original promise in Genesis 3, right after the fall. There will be enmity between the seed of woman, that is her offspring, and the seed of the serpent. The seed of the serpent will crush his heel, but he will crush the serpent's head. What we find here, in cryptic terms, is that the fall is not the end. There will be continuing conflict between the serpent and humanity, but in the end there will also be victory. Satan's head will be crushed. Now, we know how the story continues, so we are very quick to see in this the promise of the Messiah and the coming of Jesus, who then crushes the serpent's head on the cross. Yes, that is how the promise is ultimately fulfilled. But of course, at this point in Genesis 3, we cannot see this. It's not visible in the rather cryptic statement that is made. But it does make clear that something is continuing, and so it is in a sense the gospel that is proclaimed here. It's the beginning of the gospel and the beginning of the promise. Genesis 12 is where we begin to see how God is going to do this, which seed, which offspring of woman is going to accomplish this. Somehow it is linked with Abraham and his descendants. In the course of the Old Testament, we gradually find out more about how God is going to bring this about, but here is the beginning. A third theme is that of the Messianic line. Of course, it's not called the Messianic line yet. The idea of the Messiah comes later. However, it is this line from Adam to Abraham and onwards that speaks of salvation. And this is the line that will eventually lead to redemption. This is God's way of dealing with the serpent. The Old Testament will continue to trace this line, but a significant part of it is right here in the book of Genesis. The next three themes are smaller, but still interesting to pay attention to. There's the theme of election. God chooses, and he does not always choose the most obvious candidate. A number of times it is the younger, although the oldest would be the obvious choice in this culture. We first see it with Seth, although this is determined by circumstances. With Noah, there's at least a reason given why he is chosen. And then there's Shem, who may well have been the firstborn. But when it comes to Abraham, we can only wonder, why of all the people in the world does God choose Abraham? We are not told. There is no obvious reason outside of God. The line of the promise continues through Isaac, although Ishmael was the firstborn. It is Jacob, not Esau. And among the sons of Jacob, it is Joseph who is chosen, although he was one of the youngest. And then it is Ephraim, not Manasseh, although the latter was the firstborn. When they come to Jacob to be blessed at the end of Genesis, Jacob crosses his arms so that his right hand is on Ephraim, on his left. Jacob has understood something about the way God works. Topic 5 is that of sojourning, of being strangers. This is an important aspect of the life of the patriarchs. They lived as strangers in the land of promise. They were resident aliens. They never owned what was promised to them, apart from a burial plot which Abraham bought, and later Jacob purchased a plot of land near Shechem. This is all they ever owned, and they paid for it with their own money. They lived and died as foreigners. Now, in a sense, this is true for us as well. Somehow, this world is not our home. In this too, the patriarchs are examples or models for us. So, we have beginnings, the promise linked with the covenant, messianic line, election, sojourning, and then theme number 6 is that of marriage partners. It's not a big theme, but we do see it appear several times. A clear example is chapter 24, where it's about a wife for Isaac. Then there is the story of Dinah, the one on Judah and Tamar in chapter 38, and a negative example of Esau marrying women from the land, something Isaac and Rebekah find quite disagreeable. Jacob is sent to Aram, to Rebekah's family, to find a wife for himself there. Now, why is this such an important theme, is the book? Should we make the application, don't marry Canaanites? Well, it's an implicit lesson for the Israelites who are going to settle in the land of Canaan and will be tempted to intermarry with the Canaanites, a dangerous thing. These stories illustrate the dangers that are involved and provide the background for the commandments in the law against marrying Canaanites. So these are 6 important things in the book, and they will hopefully help you to maintain focus and answer the question, why of all the stories that could have been included by the author are these stories in the book of Genesis?